As Nick said, I'm from the South, and it wasn't until I got out of the South that I really started to gain some perspective on it, just from the outside looking in. This is a scene from my novel involving the protagonist who hasn't, up to this point, met his father. And that's all I'll say. The figure at Caleb's window was more beast than a man. He stood 6 feet tall, but could not have weighed 100 pounds. He leaned against the glass with his face between his thumbs, and his hair fell like a rag down over his gawking black skull. Caleb covered his nose. That was mildew on the air, rank and sour. Like when you left your clothes out in the rain too long. He could smell sulfur, too, and body odor. He drew back the covers and sat upright. "Papa," he whispered. The man's lips parted. The glass fogged up around them. Caleb sat watching him for a while. He couldn't see much in the darkness, but he knew the same must be true for the man. Finally, he stood to his feet. He lit a candle on the dresser and took it up in its tray. Then he went over slowly and held the flame out to the window. The man was all one color from head to toe, a dark and ruddy brown, the color of earth, as if he had crawled up into the world out of some hellish sinkhole. His clothes were rags, and his wet black hair came weaving down through his splayed fingers. The skin under his bottom lip was bellied slightly, as if from tobacco, and the lip itself was thin and taut. He followed Caleb with his eyes, pouched, lonesome things, the self-same brown as Caleb's own, and down at the corner of his mouth a small white clot of spittle had begun to form. Caleb lowered the candle to his waist. "To think I came from a greasy flea-bit mongrel like you," he said quietly. "It's no wonder I turned out the way I did." The saliva tailed down out of his father's mouth and vanished into a straggly black beard. Caleb watched him for only a moment longer before he reached out and unlocked the sash. If this was the future he was to inherit, then he would inherit no future at all. He threw up the window and looked the man dead in the eye. "Do it," he said. "Whatever it is you came here for, do it. Do your evil to me." The smell was unbearable. The man had drawn back a pace or two, and his head was bowed as if in fear or in penitence, and when he looked up again, his lips began to tremble. He spoke only 2 words, "My heart," and then he backed away toward the forest and was gone. Caleb could hardly feel the molten wax dripping down onto his foot. He stood staring for a long time. Then he dropped the candle and the flame winked out, and he stretched out into the darkness. "Papa!" he cried. He closed his eyes and listened. "Papa!" The night was black and deaf, and even among the darkened shapes of the trees nothing stirred. He hung there a while longer, listening. Then he pulled himself back in and slid the window shut. "The hell are you hollering about?" He turned. Oscar stood in the doorway, half drunk by the look of it. Caleb shook his head. I had a bad dream is all." "A dream?" He nodded. "Well, what's that stink in here? You got something out yonder?" Caleb glanced back at the window. "I don't got nothing nowhere." "Like hell you don't." Oscar staggered forward into the room and feinted at him so that he dodged off to the ground. Then he just stood there swaying, looking down at the candle and at the wax which had cooled to a solid on the carpet. He tested them with his toes, pawed at them clumsily. Then he raised up the window. "Who's out there, boy?" Caleb watched him, saying nothing. "Who's out there, I said." Caleb looked toward the door. Maybe if he got a good jump, he could beat him to the hall and slip out into the night. But then where would he go? But it was too late for that now. Oscar had already turned from the window to face him. "You're either hard of hearing or you're just the dumbest little son of a bitch I've ever seen. But mark me now. You'll be deaf and dumb alike if you ignore me again." Caleb narrowed his eyes. He didn't have to listen to him. Not like her. His papa was out there watching over him. His papa loved him and would keep him from harm. "So I'll ask you one more time, boy, and now's a good time to start thinking of a good answer." He slogged forward and stood towering over Caleb with his heavy eyelids flagging. "Who was out that yonder you was talking to?" Caleb lifted himself to his feet. Fully erect, he stood level with Oscar's sternum, and he gazed up boldly into those savage eyes. "You ain't my papa. I don't gotta listen to..." The open palm came clapping down into his jaw before he could finish the sentence. He saw the hand, and then he saw the wall, and then he saw his lap, and then he saw no more. But he did hear something. But he thought he heard something. A growl of dismay, footsteps, plodding and unsteady, the voice of his mother. "You'll burn for what you done to him. You'll burn, you big dumb ox." He saw. Oscar stumbling around aimlessly, groping the arm around his neck, and Mama on his back, thrashing her feet wildly and trying to choke the life out of him. The man pitched to one side but caught himself. Then he lowered his shoulder to swing her out from behind him and sent back his right elbow. She stopped flailing at once and dropped to her feet. Her mouth gaped wide, but no sound would come out. She shuffled back a few steps and then sat to the ground holding her abdomen. Oscar came over and stood over him again, breathing slowly through his nostrils. He got down on one knee and sat him up against the wall. "You told it right, boy. I ain't your papa nor no one else's. But I'll be damned if I'm just going to stand by after I get took out of sleep and told to my face that things ain't so and we both know them to be the God's plain truth. I'll be goddamned." He stood then and marched for the door. Mama braced herself, but he passed her by and disappeared into the hallway. The engine of his truck started up out in the drive, and before long it faded coughing into the distance. Mama rose. She came to him and helped him to his feet and cradled him in her arms, though he kept his own arms down by his sides like a marionette with no wires. She whispered, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And then, in a bitter, low voice, "He'll never come back here, that animal. That devil. I won't let him." His scalp was wet with her tears, and it revolted him. He wanted to break from her hold, to call her a liar, to drive her from his room like a preacher drives the devil from his chapel. But he did not. He knew he must not upset her, lest she remember what had started all of this and ask him to whom had he been calling out in the night. He had in his mind a clear image of how her face would darken whenever she spoke of his father, and how her face would go cold and her nose would prick up and she would look off with that callous indifference. So he stood still in her arms, scarcely blinking, his head cocked to one side. He stood there until she had no more tears to cry or lies to tell, and then he eased away noiselessly and went to his bed and drew the blanket up over his shoulder and face. After she had gone, he waited a few minutes and then got up and locked the door. He went again to the window and stared long into the starless night. He could escape right now if he wanted to. He could dive headlong into the darkness of the world, and if he wandered long enough, his papa would find him and take him away. "My heart," the man had said to him, his voice frail and gravelly like an ancient sigh. But where had he been when Oscar had shown up? On the air there remained only a rumor of the smell which had hung stagnant in the room. He listened further, though he knew it was in vain. Leaves rustled as trees swayed in the wind, but there came no sign from that worn and haggard nomad whose handprints had stained the window. At length Caleb bent to pick up the candlestick. He struck a match and rekindled the flame and set it on the windowsill, where it could be seen from far off. Then he climbed back into bed and watched it toss hither and thither, with no aim and no purpose, until either it went out or the world closed in around him. He would never know which.
Thank you for that. Channing Allen, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give him a